I love the look and smell of healthy soils. Gardeners will tell you it's the foundation for a great garden, and it's also the reservoir for water, nutrients, and air. You might call nutrients the food that plants need to grow. We get hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, as well as the mineral matter found in soil and organic matter. Though all the nutrients are important, the big three are nitrogen, good for leaf and stem growth; phosphorus, good for flowering, fruiting, and root development; potassium, good for disease resistance and hardiness. Now, the real challenge is creating the perfect mix, because every successful gardener will tell you it's all about the soil. So we're going to head into the garden studio to take a closer look. As we discussed last time in the studio, plants need sufficient light to grow and flourish, but they also need moisture and nutrients. Now, these two factors are greatly impacted by the growing medium, and for most of us, our gardens outdoors, that's soil. And we need to take this into account when we make our designs, and we did that for the test gardens. So let's start with a look at what soil really is, building the foundation of your garden, and how we can improve it. Now, ideal soil, which most of us don't have, is 45% mineral matter. Now, that comes from the bedrock weathering over many, many years, and that gives us the mineral portion of our ideal soil. Now, that can come from limestone, granite, or whatever your bedrock. 5% is organic matter, and that comes from decomposing plant material, leaves, dead plants, insects, other living organisms that end up in the soil. The rest is air space or pore space, half of it filled with air, 25% of the soil, and 25% of water in ideal situations. Now, most of us aren't lucky enough to have ideal soil, so let's find out what you have and how you can make it better for your plants to grow. Start by grabbing a handful of moist soil from your garden and run it through your finger and thumb. Now, if it forms a ribbon and it's kind of sticky, like modeling clay, you have a high percent of clay in your soil. Now, clay are fine particles that are plate-like in structure. They tend to hold the moisture, much like your dishes do. If you take them out of the dish drainer or the dishwasher, put them away wet, you'll notice a day or two later, there's still moisture trapped between those plates. The same happens in your soil. Now, the good news is it dries out slowly in drought. The bad news is it doesn't drain readily. It's also good because it does hold on to nutrients, but we'll need to fix it if you have a high percent. Coarse textured soils have lots of large, irregularly shaped sand particles. These feel gritty when you rub them between your finger and thumb, and as you notice, they don't hold together. These large particles drain quickly, meaning you need to water more frequently. They also don't hold on to nutrients, so you need to fertilize more frequently as well. Now, medium textured soils have equal parts of sand, silt, and clay, silt being those middle-sized particles. These tend to be ideal, holding just the right amount of moisture and containing just the right amount of air for plants to grow and thrive. Now, I've got a little demonstration to help make this come a little more truer to fact. When you think of the clay particles like plates, we're using poker chips to demonstrate, they stack up nicely and they prevent water from flowing through. So as you notice, the water's flowing through these very slowly compared to the marbles we're going to show you in a minute. We used marbles, but sand particles would be like beach balls or basketballs compared to the poker-sized clay particles. Now watch how this flows through very fast and quickly, and it doesn't hold the water. Hopefully this will remind you that if you have sand particles, they're going to drain much faster, and you'll need to water more often. Now that tells us a little bit about the different types of soil particles in your soil, but what about your exact soil? Here's a way that you can test soil on your own. You're going to need a straight-sided jar that's flat on the bottom with a lid that closes tightly, 1 cup of soil from your garden. We pulled this out from the building around here, a tablespoon of non-sudsing dish soap, and you want it non-sudsing so you can see the results of your experiment clearly. We're then going to fill this container about 3/4 full with water. Now, the soap helps break the surface tension of the water and break apart those particles in your soil. Make sure it's good and tight and shake. Now you're going to notice that the sand particles are heavier and larger, so they're going to settle out fast. And you can see they're already starting to settle in this sample. The next will be the silt, and the lightest, smallest particles, the clay, are going to take about 2 days to settle out of suspension. We put the soil from my garden, my new garden, in this jar, and from around the building, the one I just shook up now, in these containers 2 days ago. They're still settling out, but it's very clear that we have about 90% sand in my new garden soil, about 5% silt, and I think by the time the clay settles out, we'll have another 5% clay. Now what we're going to do is take a look at the soil triangle, and the soil triangle looks at the different percent of sand, silt, and clay in different soils to give you an idea of what your soil is made up of. When we look at that triangle, my soil comes out to be sandy, maybe just on the border of sandy loam. That means I have a little bit of work to get my garden in shape so it'll be easier to grow plants successfully. So once we've calculated it, you have a little bit of an idea of what you're going to need to do. We're going to talk more specifics in just a moment. Let's look at some of the more typical types of soil and see which one best describes yours. Loam is that perfect blend of sand, silt, and clay, but most of us aren't lucky enough to have that perfect ideal soil. In fact, most of us are gardening on what we call disturbed sites, leftovers from construction when our homes were being built and the topsoil was scraped off and the subsurface spread over the landscape. So let's talk a little bit more about that ideal soil that we all want. You know, it needs minimal amending because it has that good blend of sand, silt, and clay. Now mine, in my original home where I've gardened for 26 years, may not be ideal, but it's pretty close. Years of adding compost and organic matter and using organic mulches and working the soil, it's really become a nice mix of a little bit of clay, a little bit of organic matter, and some silt. So maybe not perfect, but as close as I could get to on my own. Now the nice part about loam, it has sufficient nutrient and water holding capacity, and that means your soil is the most effective at holding moisture for your plants to use, plus a great nutrient reservoir, reducing the amount of work you need to do to effectively and grow healthy and productive plants. Now clay soil, on the other hand, is a common problem. We really need to do some work. As we showed you, it's poorly drained, so you're going to need to increase that drainage so it holds a little bit of moisture, but it drains away to avoid root rot. As I mentioned, great water holding ability during drought, but a little too good, so we end up with problems. But it is a great reservoir for nutrients, so we need to adjust our fertilization program accordingly. Usually need to use fewer nutrients when we're dealing with clay, less fertilizer. Sandy soil, as I showed you, had great drainage. Now that's okay because you control the water if water isn't an issue, but you will need to water more often and find ways to conserve moisture more so than other soils. So we don't need to increase the drainage, but we do need to increase the water holding ability. Also, as I mentioned, sand doesn't hold the nutrients well, so we're going to do some things to increase that nutrient holding capacity so we don't need to fertilize as often, but still have great garden results. Now remember, the best way to find out about your soil and what you need to do to improve the growing conditions is with the soil test, one that you've submitted to a certified soil lab to tell you not only the sand, silt, and clay particles, but all the other things you need to know to do to improve your soil and select your fertilization program. You can test your soil any time of the year as long as the soil isn't frozen and you haven't recently fertilized. Obviously, if you just fertilized your soil, it's going to skew those results. Start by testing new gardens or any that are struggling, or like in our large garden, one that's been neglected. The solution and the plan of attack to improving the growing conditions may be revealed in that soil test. Now, most soils in general benefit from an addition of organic matter. It's the key to a wonderful soil and building a great foundation for a healthy and productive garden. Now, organic matter improves drainage in clay soils. It increases the water holding capacity in sandy soils. It's just this amazing material. It feeds the good soil bacteria, fungi, earthworms, and other organisms in the soil. It also adds some microorganisms that are good for healthy soil and plant growth, and even provides a few nutrients as well. You can make your own if you compost. So what is compost? It's basically mixing plant waste or debris that's free of weed seeds, insect-free and disease-free, and of course no invasive plants, and no animal products, meat, dairy, and bones, mixed together. Now these products, the raw materials, can be placed in a pile or a trench and allowed to rot. And keep in mind, the more work you do, like turning and making sure it's moist, the consistency of a sponge that's been wrung out, that the more work you do, the faster you get results. But if you do nothing, nature will take care of it and it'll eventually rot. Now, one of the things that you can do is make composting and adding organic matter a regular part of your gardening. Some gardeners ask me, well, if I add compost or organic matter every year, won't my garden be a foot higher at the end of the decade? That's really not how it works. You see, 100 pounds of organic matter breaks down and becomes 10 pounds in 1 year. And the following year, that 10 pounds breaks down to 1 pound. Now this means it's an ongoing process, and it's a process you want to continue to do, and it's actually the process, not the material, that makes the difference in the end run. It's the microorganisms, the bacteria, fungi, and other organisms that break the organic matter down, and as they do this, they release a glue-like substance that creates those aggregates, those good clumps of soil, bringing those sand particles together so they hold moisture longer, and breaking apart those clay particles so that they allow the soil to drain much more quickly. Here's another way you can put yard waste to work in your garden. Shred up those fall leaves and incorporate them into vacant annual vegetable and flower gardens in the fall. They'll decompose over winter. It's a great way to amend the soil and recycle this resource right in your yard. Or you can use shredded leaves as a mulch. It's a form of sheet composting. You know what nature does? All those leaves fall, form a layer, and decompose over time. That's what your mulch will do, improving the soil and suppressing weeds and conserving moisture. Now you may need to supplement what you make as compost by purchasing other organic matter. Peat is one type of organic matter that you may have seen sold or may have used in the past. It's decomposed plant material. Slightly acidic, so some gardeners use it. Doesn't have a big impact, but a little bit. Any organic matter will, actually. Now, when you open the bag, you may be amazed at how much is really crammed in there. It's very compressed, and it just seems to pop right out of the bag. You'll have to break it up, and you'll want to make sure it's moist when you dig it into the soil. Now, some of you may be concerned about the ecology and eco-friendliness of peat moss, but some, like the Canadian peat growers, are required to harvest in an eco-friendly manner. What they have to do is report water quality and restore the bogs after harvesting, and they can only harvest a certain amount at one time. Aged manure is a common product. You'll find bagged in the garden center. Or if you live in a rural area, you might be able to get it from a nearby farm or stable. Now, it's very low in nutrients, but it does add good organic matter. Now, we like it aged because if not, what happens with fresh manure is you can burn some plants or, more frequently, encourage lots of leaf and stem growth at the expense of flowers. Another type is coir. It's a relatively new product. It's a byproduct of the coconut industry. It's basically the outer hulls, the husk, ground up and used as a soil additive now. It looks very much like peat moss, but it's sold usually in blocks like this, very compressed. It's pH neutral, so it's not acidifying like peat moss, and it holds more water, 7 times its dry weight. Now, there are some soil amendments you need to really approach with caution. You may have heard of using lime to improve drainage in soil. It can come as a powder or pelleted like you see here. Now, it does improve drainage in clay soil. However, it increases the soil pH. Now, what does that matter? Well, pH influences nutrient uptake of the plants. So if you look at this chart, you can see where nutrients are most available around 6.5, the ideal pH for garden soil. As we go more alkaline or higher pH or sweeter soil, you can see some things are tied up and less available, like phosphorus and potassium. And as it gets more acidic, less nutrients are available. Now, we do use lime to raise the pH of acid soils to get them closer to that 6.5, but we don't apply them to alkaline soils because we don't want to tie up those nutrients that are already limited to the plants. And we never want to apply lime without a soil test because if you overapply, it takes years to undo. Now, sulfur can come as a powder also, or granulars or flakes like you see here. It's applied to very alkaline soils to lower the pH. That increases the availability of iron, manganese, and other nutrients, as we saw on our pH chart. Now, typically takes a lot of sulfur to make any significant change in soil pH, and those are usually levels that can burn or kill plants. You also need oxygen for it to be active, so it's something that's usually done when establishing a garden. Now, this sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? So the best and easiest solution is to select plants suited to the pH of your soil. Now, in garden publications and on the back of the fertilizer bag, you'll find lots of general fertilization recommendations for the plants you're growing. As you can see on this bag of fertilizer, it talks about warm season grasses, cool season grasses, annuals, flowers, trees, and shrubs. It also helps you set the spreader so you know what setting to put your spreader when applying your fertilizer. Now, honestly, if you've taken a soil test, that's the best because you'll follow these recommendations. A soil test will ensure you add the right product at the right amount for your soil and the plants you're growing. This means you're going to buy just what you need. You'll have better results, healthier plants, more blooms, an abundant harvest, and you'll be kind to the environment and waste less time and money fertilizing unnecessarily. Timing is also something to consider when fertilizing. You do have some flexibility. You want to fertilize prior to planting, typically with annual vegetables and flowers or when starting a new garden. You can fertilize after planting to give your plants a mid-season boost or with existing gardens. And we should always be fertilizing as needed, not because of the time of year. We do tend to over-fertilize plants, so make sure your plants need that nutrient boost before applying fertilizer. This is especially important with perennials, trees, and shrubs. And with perennials, trees, and shrubs, we want to avoid late-season fertilization because that can stimulate late-season growth and increase the risk of winter kill. So for these, we typically fertilize our perennials in early spring and our trees in early spring before growth begins or fall after they're dormant for trees and shrubs. Now there's a lot more to learn about soil and fertilizer, but we've got enough to get finished prepping our test gardens and start planting. Let's go back out to the larger lot to see what we need to do for our 2 beds. Now that we've fine-tuned our garden plan, it's time to get out and start planting. And I thought we'd start with seeds. Here's a couple things to keep in mind. You may notice that my rows are pretty close together. I'm doing wide row planting, leaving just enough room for the plants to grow and reach maturity. In this case, I've used pelletized radish seeds. These are coated so they're bigger and easier to plant. I'm going to plant them at the spacing and depth recommended on the package for every seed I do. Proper spacing is important, often overlooked, because it's a little more tedious, but guess what? You'll do less thinning, removing of those excess plants, so you waste less seeds and really, in the long run, less time. So we're gonna properly space these, give them room to reach maturity. We're gonna cover with soil, tamp to ensure good seed to soil contact, and then water them in. Keep the soil slightly moist until the seeds sprout and then water thoroughly and less frequently to encourage good deep roots. Now that we've got some seeds in the ground, we're going to finish out this bed later, but let me show you how to put some transplants in your other garden bed. As you can see, I like to set my plants out on the soil surface before putting them in the ground. That way I can adjust and make sure they're properly spaced. A lot easier to move them before they go in the ground. I've also staggered the rows so I can cram them in just a bit more, get more plants for my square footage. but still leaving them enough room to reach their full size. Now, when you were visiting the garden center, you probably noticed plants come in a variety of containers. The peppers here, for example, are in cell packs. We're going to lightly squeeze to make it easy to slide them out. We're not going to yank them out by the stem, but rather overturn that container and slide them out. When you notice the roots, if any of them are pot-bound and circling, we're going to just gently tease them. It won't hurt the plant, but rather encourages those roots to explore the ground around the planting hole. Now, many growers are starting to provide plants in biodegradable pots. These pots can be planted. So basically, we take off the part that doesn't biodegrade, dig a hole, because we're going to plant our plants at the same depth they were growing in the container. That is for everything but tomatoes. Those can go deeper. So we've got our hole, and we're going to set this at the same depth. Now we're going to remove any of the lip of the container that will be exposed so it doesn't dry out. Now you may be looking at this cloudy day and wondering why we're planting. Well, it's a good way to reduce transpiration, moisture loss from the plants, so as they're adjusting to their new home, it's a little less stressful. Once in the ground, gently tamp, and don't forget to water. There are different ways to handle tomatoes, and one of the things you want to consider is how deep you plant them. We can plant these a little deeper because they'll root all along the stem. This is especially important for long-leggy plants. Remove any lower leaves that'll be buried. Dig a nice deep hole or trench for those of you in cooler climates. Cover the roots and a bit of the stem and gently tamp. With determinate tomatoes, those that grow a certain height and stop, we can grow those sprawled on the ground or with a short stake. Indeterminate tomatoes like this cherry tomato keep growing until the frost kills the top or you pinch it off. Train these on a stake for earlier fruit and fewer fruit. In a later segment, we're going to do some suckering and remove those extra suckers as well. And we can also use towers. Easier because no pruning's needed. And notice we have a nice tall tower because if you've grown towered tomatoes before, you may have had them topple over. So we'll have a little bit later fruit production, more of it, and definitely fewer disease and insect problems. Now let's look at some other ways to go vertical. Going vertical not only saves space, but it can increase productivity. You can purchase a trellis or do what we did and create your own using twigs or stems or branches, or purchase some stakes and then wrap twine around them so that the plants actually have something to grow upon and up and over the support. Now we're going to increase productivity by growing peas during the cool season. And then when the weather warms, we're going to replace them with beans. We've got 2 crops in one location and possibly a third when the weather cools. So growing vertically not only saves space, but it also makes harvesting much easier. Now we're going to finish up this bed a little bit later, but I want to take you back to the pool garden so you can see some of the challenges we had in that planting bed. We've been to the garden center and we kind of tested out our plan a little bit. We looked at the color combinations and the plant combinations, made some last minute substitutions because all the plants weren't available. We've brought them back here. We're storing them in a shady location so they'll be less stressed and we'll have to water less often, just often enough to keep the soil moist. And now we're ready to set them out and give our plan one last test before we begin planting. Well, we laid out our plants and did our final edit on the plan. As you can see, I have a few things left over, and I think that happens to all of us. You know, we do our planning, we do our placement, and find out maybe our idea didn't quite work. I love to mix edibles in with my ornamentals, so I picked up a couple of blueberries. They didn't quite fit the design. They have beautiful flowers, nice fall color, but just didn't blend with the rest of the plants. But don't worry, I've got a place for them, and that's just what you're going to find out you'll do. Put them in containers, put your plants into another bed, find a use for them, and a new home. I also picked some roses. The homeowners really wanted some roses. Low maintenance, landscape quality roses, disease-free and hardy. We picked them out for this bed, but it didn't quite work. But I found another spot where I think they'll enjoy them even more, and that happens often. The other thing I wanted to do was include some strawberries as a ground cover. As I watched the sun and shade patterns throughout the day, I found out it didn't get quite as much sun as I liked, and I also didn't like the texture of the strawberries with the other plants. But I was able to add a few other things. I love parsley, the texture of the curly parsley and that dark green. Plus, it attracts swallowtail caterpillars. Great addition to the landscape. Plus, you can eat it and it freshens your breath. And then Swiss Chard, one of my favorite is Swiss chard, bright lights. It gets about this tall, produces until it gets really hot, and those colorful stems look great. We're tucking them under the Japanese maples. That little extra shade is going to help them last into the summer, and it'll brighten up that shade with the colorful stems. What we did do, though, is we saved some plants from a friend. They donated some miscanthus, some ornamental grasses that were really too big for their spot. You can see we packed them into some grocery bags to keep the roots nice and moist until they were ready for planting. We only used about half of them, so we're going to find another home. Why I like them is the tall grasses really make a nice screening for that fence and a good backdrop. I like to start my design from the back, just like I plant, and work my way forward. Baptisia is another wonderful plant, and it's a great plant because it's got these nice blue-green leaves and blue flowers. It'll be a nice contrast to the vertical interest of the miscanthus. The blue flowers in late spring and early summer will brighten up this bed. We decided to use a lot of blues and pinks in here to complement the maples and add a little spark and also echo the pool. So the Baptisia will be great. When the flowers are gone, the black seed pods will persist through fall and into winter for some added interest. We included some penstemon dark towers, and I like this one because the red of the foliage echoes the red of the Japanese maple. We put a cluster in the middle to unify this bed, so we didn't have bookends in the garden, but rather it kind of flowed much better. So again, a different texture, nice color echoing, and a great way to add a little punch to our garden. Catmint is a great plant for hot, dry areas. Now this is a clumper that doesn't run through and take over your garden. The blue-green foliage is a really nice contrast to that red. The blue flowers last all summer, tolerates hot, dry conditions, and forms a mound of flowers, and it's just beautiful, soft texture. And it attracts bees and beneficial insects. If it starts looking ratty, one haircut in the summer, and you're set for the season. We also included a shrub, Caryopteris. And this is a shrub that's going to have blue flowers late in the season. So we start off with the blue Baptisia, fill the summer with the blue catmint, end the season with the blue Caryopteris. Great for bringing in bees, and they won't hurt you because they love the nectar. And this big shrub will get about 4 to 5 feet tall, and we'll prune it back in late winter to keep it under control. We added some lavender because our homeowners wanted fragrance. The wonderful foliage is great. The blue flowers are good for cutting and potpourris. And when you walk by, just a wonderful whiff. That fragrance is incredible. You might want to consider adding fragrance to your garden as well. Great aromatherapy, good additional interest for your landscape. And last, we use some Echinacea Powwow Wild Berry. Introduced a couple years ago as an All-America Selection winner, this is a great perennial. It starts to bloom the first year. That pinkish red echoes the Japanese maple. We've got clusters throughout to unify the garden. Great for cutting, great for butterflies. Up close, so we get a lot of color right in the front of the garden. And then you may notice we've got lots of space left between our plants. We don't want to have to get in and dig and divide right away, so we're going to give the plants room to grow. But this first season, we're going to fill those spaces with bronze fennel. Light, airy texture, great for caterpillars, wonderful for seasoning food. It will reseed, so we'll have plants the first few years as our perennials grow and fill in. They didn't have plants when we purchased our perennials, so we're going to need to go back and either pick up some seeds later or some small transplants to fill in. Now that we've got our plants laid out, we're ready to plant. I've got a few tips to help you have great success when planting your perennials. I like to start from the back and move forward. That way it's easy and I don't plant myself into the center of the bed. You may notice we left some space at the back of the bed. That's for easy access to the fence for maintenance, to the speakers to keep them well wired and in good shape, and also to maintain the perennials. Now, you notice I dug a hole already. I like to use a shovel to make sure I get it nice and wide so those roots have a running start, just the depth of the pot. And then I always keep a trowel handy in case I need to fine-tune the hole. And then roughen up the sides, especially important for those of you gardening in clay soil. Gently roll the pot to loosen the roots and then slide it out of the container. Next, we want to check for any girdling roots, those that grow around the pot and will eventually strangle the plant. This Baptisia has really thick roots, so I'm going to use pruners to clip any that are growing in circles. Not too bad. Notice that the hole is wider. That's a common mistake. We try to push that plant into that small hole. I like to have a trowel to loosen the sides, make sure it's the same depth as it was growing in the container, and backfill with the soil we amended. Notice we took it out of the pot and planted it right away. We don't want those roots exposed to the air where they dry out and make transplant shock much greater. We're going to gently tamp to ensure good root to soil contact and water after we're done planting the bed. But if you run out of time, happens to all of us, leave the other plants in their containers and water as needed. It's important to get them in the ground as soon as possible, but make sure that those roots are protected. We're going to finish planting this bed, and then we'll talk a bit about mulch. There's a couple things to consider when selecting the mulch for your landscape: function, aesthetics, and cost. Function is basically, how does that react and help the plants? I like organic mulches. They conserve moisture, they moderate soil temperature, keeping the roots cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. And as they break down, they improve the soil by adding organic matter. Stone mulches are heavier and don't improve the soil, but many people like the look, thus the aesthetics. I'm also big on being sustainable, so I like to reuse products that are in my landscape. Leaves that have fallen, I shred them with my mower and spread them around my plants. It's free, and it's a way to reuse them right in the landscape. Or maybe evergreen needles. They don't make the soil too acidic, and they're nice to walk on barefoot as well. Or you can purchase shredded bark or chip up your landscape trimmings into wood chips to use in your landscape. That's what we're using here in this perennial garden. And cost. What is affordable and fits in your landscape budget. Now, when putting down the mulch, it can be a little tricky to cover the ground without burying your plants. So I love using this trick. Take an old pot, or in this case, an ice cream bucket, and turn it upside down. We're going to place the mulch all around. Notice I've added a layer of newspaper. If you remember, we had tons of weeds in this bed, so we want the newspaper to give us an extra layer of mulch. Then we'll cover it, and we won't bury the plant. We'll lift that pot off when we're done mulching, and it'll be neatly finished. So I'm gonna get busy mulching this garden, and then I'm gonna water it in well to make sure my plant roots are nice and moist, and I'll check them throughout the growing season. Whew. We've certainly covered a lot. We've talked about the importance of good soil. We did some digging, converted grass to garden, and old beds to new. We've even done some work on our large lot. You're now ready to go. In our next session, we'll take on some challenges in our small space and study the science behind light and water. In the meantime, happy digging.